Hi, everyone. We might as well get started. People will probably continue to wander in. On behalf of the Office of Research, I'd like to welcome you to today's special Roads to Research presentation. Please help yourself to the coffee. And as a reminder, if you were here last week, you already know that these presentations are filmed. Today we're going to hear from 4 of Royal Road's Doctor of Social Science students. These students are in the second year of their 4-year program, and they're using the Roads to Research series to share their research ideas with our friendly research community. Each presentation will be about 5 minutes, followed by about 5 minutes of questions, so it's not that long. Based on last week, that was enough for only 2 or 3 questions, so it goes by pretty fast. I'll introduce each presenter in turn. The first is Diana Freethy, and the title of her presentation is Moving Beyond Barriers, Strengthening Collaborative Fisheries Management on the Skeena River.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for coming out today. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background context about myself so that you can understand where my research project is coming from, and then I'll kind of walk you through a broader scope, narrow it down, and then give you a little bit more information about my research design proposal. So, I work for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and I've taken on a number of different roles in that organization, but a lot of them have kind of focused more on the fisheries management side of things, and in those fisheries management experiences, there have been a lot of collaborative type forums that I've been engaged with, and in those experiences I've noticed some interesting challenges arising, and I thought, you know, I really would like to do something to try and improve those. So I'm looking at moving beyond barriers and strengthening collaboration within the Skeena River watershed. Now, this kind of brings to the larger governmental policy at context, and there's been a great deal of movement internationally to work more collaboratively with folks that are interested in things like natural resources and fisheries. And DFO, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, is no exception. We have a mission statement that includes working collaboratively towards following strategic outcomes that are listed there. And we've also developed policies within the department that also support collaboration very directly, one being the wild salmon policy, which is this publication here on the bottom. Any of the images, by the way, there's links on the bottom, and if anyone's interested, I can always give those to you afterwards. I haven't directly listed references at the end. They're all on the individual slides. So when we look at fisheries management on the BC coast, we can see when we look that there's actually a great deal, and I'm not really supposed to be walking away from the mics, but there's a collaboration that goes along all on this coast. But I happen to live right about in there, in Prince Rupert, and there's a watershed, this one right here, that is roughly in there. Very close to Prince Rupert. And so I've chosen to focus on the Skeena River watershed because we've historically experienced a number of collaboration challenges in that area. So there's 2 processes that are no longer in existence that were collaborative fisheries management processes, one being the Skeena River Watershed Committee and the other being the Watershed Initiative. And when we look at those watersheds, we can see that there's a great deal of diversity within them. So part of this challenges around collaboration is recognizing these types of diversity. So you can see on the far side, there's a number of different participants: First Nations, commercial fishers, recreational fishers. There's more than one governmental body responsible for fisheries management in that area. And there's also a number of different interests in terms of those participants. So we've got First Nation rights and titles issues, commercial and recreational harvest issues, environmental and economic considerations. So it gets really interesting when these collaborative initiatives transpire. So this leads into my research goals, and what I'd like to do is focus on the watershed and identify the principal barriers to collaboration and looking at what those causes are and what the impacts of those are, and then taking that and working towards a better understanding of what the historical processes are, and then working towards recommending ways to improve those fisheries management processes and hopefully natural resource management collaborations more largely. So I'm looking at doing a case study and doing a historical collaborative Skeena River fisheries management case study focusing on the Skeena Watershed Committee and the Skeena Watershed Initiative. The theoretical underpinnings of this work is going to involve systems, a systems approach, but I'm also going to be looking at complexity and communications and conflict theories as well. The data collection methods, I'm going to be undertaking semi-structured interviews with the historical Skeena River process participants of both processes, and then doing a document analysis of the collaborative natural resource management literature, and that's on an international scale. So I'll be drawing from more than just fisheries management processes. I'll be looking at things like deer management, water management, parks management, things like that. And I'll also be undergoing some participant observations. So there's no actual collaborative fisheries management process in the Skeena River watershed currently. So I'm going to be participating in meetings that are related to Skeena River fisheries management, but are not actually part of a formal process. The data analysis is going to involve two different avenues. So the first avenue will be qualitative content analysis. I'll be using interview data through this and analyzing that using in vivo software. And I'll be identifying barriers, causes, and impacts, hopefully from that analysis. To supplement that, I'll be looking at document analysis or discourse analysis around the ongoing meeting participation for the ongoing collaborative fisheries management discussions, and also doing the same for the international case study literature. And combining that through a constant comparison method with the data analysis of the qualitative content analysis of the interview data, and informing recommendations using both of those resources. This will lead into two different kinds of research outcomes. So there's more knowledge-based or scientific outcomes, one being new knowledge about the barriers within the watershed and within collaborative fisheries management, and also on possible ways to overcome those barriers. In more practical terms, I'm looking at making recommendations to address collaborative Skeena River fisheries management barriers, and I'd also like to contribute to the development of operational tools for practitioners. So things that are really practical for folks on the ground that they can use as a tool to both facilitate and increase the effectiveness of collaboration. I also intend to present these research results to the participants that are interested, that are within the Skeena River watershed, and hopefully to do some form of workshopping or things like that to be able to share my information. And I also like to be able to take this and extrapolate it to a broader audience, so taking it and actually making some recommendations that may improve collaboration for natural resource management more broadly. And that's everything. If there's anyone with questions.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
You want to ask a question? Thank you. I'll take that with your compliment. So you have a number of interested parties here,
Yes.
some of whom perhaps don't like each other and have disagreements and may have specific agendas with respect to what they want to achieve or any kind of conversation that they have. So is the research methodology, the interview that you've established, reflective of the fact that people will have these kind of different perspectives or different agendas with respect to what you're going to collect and how you collect that? So that does your methodology allow for that flexibility of access to information? And the second thing, which is, how do you correct for the perception of bias? So you come with DFO, I'm here to help you, I'm with government, and this is going to be objective, all the things you do. So whether you personally are perceived as biased, certainly the organization is considered someone with an agenda. So how are you going to account for that potential bias and the differentiation in terms of your of the people you're going to be interviewing?
Thank you. In response to your first regarding the questionnaire flexibility, yes, there will be flexibility built within the questionnaire. And I am sensitive to the fact that there is definitely very different interests and quite a bit of history and conflict and whatnot, and very opposing views between some of those parties. But that's one of the reasons that this work is so important in being able to find ways to overcome those. So the questionnaire is in development currently and is certainly working those into its design, those aspects.
So we'll do the second one a little bit later, but then if you're sitting down with First Nations, are you going to give them an interview, a questionnaire, or are you going to sit with them and say, as a group, what are some of the issues or perceptions? In other words, how you collect data from them may be very different than you do from outfitters or other people involved, or are you just going to have a standard questionnaire?
It's going to be a semi-structured interview, and I'm intending to do this in person. Those interviews, it should be noted that the First Nations engage with the department in this watershed generally through a fisheries manager. So there's somebody that's dedicated within a department for the First Nations that are within the watershed that come and sit with DFO in different ways, or we go and sit with them, we as in the department. This comes back to your second question is, I am an employee of DFO, yes, and I need to very much disclose that to all folks. But I am also a researcher, and I am conducting this because as an individual, I saw something that has challenges, and I'd like to do something to overcome those challenges and make things better. So it's not, there's definitely possible perceptions of bias, and I'm aware of that. It's disclosed in all of my proposal information, and also it's going to be something that I'm going to be disclosing to research participants. And it can be a benefit and it can be a drawback, and I think it's how that I frame it, and just being really honest with folks that that's the case. I also have been working within this watershed for some time now, and I do have relationships with some of these folks in a number of different capacities because of the different roles that I've taken on. So I think that's really a strength, that there already is a relationship. We also have really good relationships with a lot of these folks, with other staff members in the field. So yeah, it's not a perfect world, but I think it can really be a benefit also in terms of drawing information that will help support the study.
Have you thought about using a third party to collect that information? Because whether, as a researcher, your objectivity is really important and critical, but if I'm speaking to DFO and I believe I can get some influence, even the fact that you're a researcher doing this project not for DFO, but the point is, can I yet again influence DFO in a way that would be favorable to me? How do I account for it? And simply saying, I know I'm from DFO, but I'm doing this in terms of research, may not be sufficient to alter that. So I guess the question that I'd ask you to think about carefully is, how can I ensure that the perceived bias that I would have because of my employment is accounted for or reduced in whatever way?
Okay, thank you. And I'm definitely considering that. One of the avenues that I have taken very recently is to establish a committee member, a committee that has members that are academic only. I don't want a perception that this research is going to be, it's not industry driven, it's personal. And folks within the department are aware of what I'm doing and are supportive because there's a common interest, and there's been challenges on all behalves, right? It's something that everyone is interested in. It's just on how we're going to get there. So thank you very much.
I think there's time for one more question.
Just one more. Okay, sure. I'll try to keep it short then. My question is a bit different. When I was with the Ministry of Education, I conducted province-wide consultations with many different stakeholders, and I have to say that this really resonated with me. I agree that you need to find the barriers, address them, and so on. I'm wondering if you have looked a bit further afield to see if there are models out there that they could be from business or commerce or any field that might be already a way to overcome barriers. Like, have you heard of anything like that, or talked to somebody like where I worked in my capacity? I think I encountered a lot of the same sort of challenges to collaboration.
It's interesting, in the fisheries management and natural resource management field, there's a great deal of work that's been done on barriers per se, and yet not being formed into more of a framework that's actually something practitioners can use. So the initial driver of this work was to bring forward those kinds of tools and draw the information that's already been done into something that's a cohesive product for use in the field. And so that's actually what my driving end goal is I really want to take this and keep going with it. And that's part of the reason I want to take it to the workshop type of a format, is to keep getting that feedback and keep being able to inform the development of a model that would be appropriate. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Diana. Next up is Nancy Gilbert. The title of her presentation is Improving Sanitation in the Niger Delta. Just forward. Oops, there you are. Perfect. And that's a laser. A what? A laser.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My interest and indeed my passion is how to improve sanitation in the Niger Delta. For the last 3 years or so, I've been working in southern Nigeria. The Niger Delta is made up of about 9 states in the south of Nigeria, and they surround the area where the Niger River comes down and hits the Atlantic Ocean, hence Delta. The purpose of my research is really to gain practical knowledge about effective tools at the grassroots level that can help in the implementation of improved sanitation. And we're looking for sustainable community change that will then drive improved health incomes and, in fact, improve economic situations for people. And I'm particularly focused in these riverine areas, which is the area right close to the ocean where communities are off the grid. There are lots of creeks and rivers, and it's a very unique environment. But if we can get some insight into how to make change sustainably, that can lead to scale up, and that will really have a huge impact in the area. It's a huge challenge in Nigeria. Nigeria is not on track, which is a particular definition by the WHO and UNICEF, to meet the Millennium Development Goal for sanitation. And it's hard to get your head around the fact that they estimate 39 million people in the country practice open defecation, which is exactly what it sounds like. And so open defecation includes these kinds of latrines that you see in the riverine area, but it's just, the fecal matter goes just right down into the ground, and the tide comes in and out, and it's not a pretty sight. 20 feet away, the people will be bathing and washing themselves, washing their clothes. So it's a very difficult situation. And then, of course, sometimes they do use bushes, etc. I included the next slide because for me, it spoke to why this program was so resonated so much with me. Because really, sanitation practices are not technical. This is not a scientific kind of thing. It's a social phenomena. And so the Rural Roads program is entirely appropriate. One slide on literature review, just a top line on looking at the literature. There's no question that poor sanitation has very serious negative impacts on health and quality of life. I found no research on cultural norms and attitudes about sanitation in the Niger Delta. Big gap in the knowledge, so there's an opportunity to provide some good work there. There is lots of research elsewhere about how you can approach change, sustainable change, how you can deal with changing knowledge, attitudes, and practices, and what the barriers might be. But interestingly, in all of the literature, there were 2 key points that were kept coming to the surface. One is that, each situation is unique. So what works in Ghana or what works in Tanzania may or may not work in southern Nigeria. And how critical it was to include the end user in whatever implementation you do. Because it's critical that that end user participate, feel like they're collaborating in the endeavor, and have that sense of ownership. Lastly, the literature showed that there are limited appropriate technologies effective in those riverine areas. And I think the next slide will show why that is the case. This is from the air. I actually showed this last year. Some of you may remember it. But it gives you a sense of how much water there is there. It's at sea level, huge amounts of rain. And so the water table is very high, very prone to flooding. And so the only appropriate technologies to really effectively deal with sanitation are either composting toilets or biodigesters, both of which keep the human waste separate from the environment until it becomes benign. So that's just sort of an added challenge to this whole thing, that I have a bias towards working with biodigesters, but whether the community would want to do that or not is going to be an interesting question. So my research question, as is the case with so many of my colleagues, continues to change regularly. Today, this is my research question. In riverine communities of the Niger Delta, what are the barriers to improved sanitation practices, and what factors could lead to sustainable, healthy, and environmentally sound sanitation practices? And that leads to a whole series of sub-questions. Given that I only have 5 minutes, I'm not going to go through that. But my hypothesis is that if we're able to work in a collaborative manner to build knowledge and that trust, that sense of participation, if the community can understand the value in change, so maybe it's health issues, maybe it's not, maybe it's, the biofuel from biodigesters that they see as value, and they see leadership embracing change, so those key influencers in the communities, and they feel able to make change, because I know that's been a huge issue in my work to date, that sense of helplessness. Out of that, sustainable sanitation solutions will follow. My methodology is active research. I'm working with an NGO there. I have a team, sanitation coordinator. We want to work with selected communities, so they will be part of it. And we would work together to develop the intervention and implement. And my methods will include a little bit of quantitative, but mostly qualitative. So semi-structured interviews, mostly. And as it's so important with action research to share your information, I added this slide. So not only would we share with the community, but through PIN, the NGO that I work with, we would be putting information online, we would do training programs. We have a demonstration center, so we have an opportunity to be leaders in terms of introducing ways of making change. And then we work with other collaborating partners who we would be bringing along. And in addition, I'm hoping to publish some articles and attend conferences. I think that's about it. References and a picture. All right. So, Alan, your question.
Well, so my name is Nancy. I'm from Canada.
Yes.
I'm a doctoral student. I'm here to help you.
I'm here to work with you, if you would like to work with me.
So how do you do that? I mean, there's. So what's the problem that you believe your research is going to help? And how does it become compelling? Because keeping my family eating or doing just surviving in terms of this, long-term health is really not a significant issue. What strategies? I mean, the action research I think is really important. So you're doing something that's significant, but with the intention of making some improvement. And how do you?
I can't go in there and say, I've got a great idea for you. You've got to listen to me. I can't do that. And I know that from my work in this sector. I have to be able to engage them. I have to listen to what they have to say. And if they want to make change, or if in response to some thoughts I might share, they want to make change, then they might be selected as the community that I actually want to study.
You talked about dealing with leaders. Are women significant power brokers in families? Are they? Is this part? Could you align with women's groups or something, or has it got to be elders of?
Elders are very key. Traditional elders, because there is a whole traditional leadership structure there. Very important. Secular leaders are key. I would definitely want to include women and youth. And it's really interesting watching the dynamic of women in these communities, because yes, there are women groups and there are women leaders, but women are definitely second-class citizens. Yes?
Well, you say that the solution is different according to different contexts, and people have to be involved in the solution. The last time I went to Vancouver, they had the same solution to the one they have in Victoria, which is flushing toilets, and they didn't ask me to be involved in a dialogue, and nor do I want to be involved in a dialogue about how these things are done. So, I mean, obviously I appreciate that there's a huge difference here, but what about development? I mean, presumably one of the critiques would be, that this is low-grade, low-level stuff, unambitious, limited horizons, and that you're helping to hold, that region back, because actually what they need is infrastructure. I know we had a bit of a discussion about it last time you were here, but where are you with that now, and how will you incorporate that into this? Because I can see that being a critique.
Well, I think in urban areas, looking at something like flush toilets might make sense. In these riverine communities, it just doesn't make sense. They don't have water systems. You need water for flush toilets. Putting in the infrastructure would be hugely expensive. So the idea of being able to leapfrog over that technology, which is in fact what biodigesters have the potential to do, is really interesting. So it's something that works in that environment, it can be affordable in that environment, and in the end, it's probably a better solution than what we might use here in a city.
So then you would indeed convince me by saying, look, in Canada, we also have them here in these dispersed communities, and it is indeed leapfrogging over a technology that you don't need. That would be a way of engaging them in that dialogue to show that...
If they were interested in what was happening in Canada, yeah. I don't know whether they would be or wouldn't. That might excite them or turn them off. It's a very complex and very interesting environment. They watch TV at night using their generators, and they don't have toilets and they don't have running water. I mean, priorities are just sometimes seem wacky from our perspective. Yes.
Yeah, and that's where I was going, actually. I was wondering, do they see it as a problem?
Well, that's an interesting question. And as I delve into this, I'm getting some mixed results. And that may be one of the big challenges, is how do you get them to appreciate that?
Like a vision or, you know,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that's one reason why I think biodigesters are so interesting, because if biofuel is an output, there's an economic benefit to them. That they might not care about the health issues. And in fact, research has shown elsewhere, the health issues don't turn people's cranks. It's keeping up with the Joneses, or it's, you know, it's other things that have bigger impacts. So it's very interesting. Oh, time's up. Yay. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. The next presenter is Dan Guinan, and the title of his presentation is Reconciliation Dialogue by Non-Aboriginal Employees of Post-Secondary Institutes in BC.
Thank you, Vanessa. Haichka Hosiem, I just want to... I'm going the wrong way? Or I'm pointing it the wrong way. I guess it's supposed to be intuitive. Yes, Haichka Hosiem, I want to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt people that were on and doing this work today, and also the leadership of the Royal Roads University, and all of you for witnessing this excellent work that we're doing today. The topic of my presentation is Indigenizing Post-Secondary in BC. This is a picture of an Aboriginal-controlled post-secondary institute, and I actually work for a different one, but also an Aboriginal controlled post-secondary institution, and I'm actually looking at indigenizing the public post-secondary institutions, of which there are, I think, 25 in BC. And so my question is, what narratives do post-secondary education employees use to infuse Indigenous values, ideas, values, symbols, aesthetics, procedures, authentic history? And the reason I'm doing that is because that's the working definition of what indigenization is, and it comes from the Indigenous Scholars Network. And their vision is that the colleges, universities, and institutes would be as thoroughly a product of Indigenous imaginations and aspirations as it is of the Western settler ones. So that might not be an attainable outcome, but it's a vision. And why it's important is because although in 2011, in that census, we, for the first time for non-Aboriginal people, had more people with bachelor's degrees than high school leavers, there's still a huge gap in the Aboriginal community, and you'll also see that the number of Aboriginal people with bachelor's degrees is increasing, but it's actually increasing at a slower rate than the non-Aboriginal people. So if you, this is 10 years, so if you project out another 10, 15 years, it's going to be a while until we close the gap, if ever. So I'm looking at this topic from the perspective of the reconciliation literature, reconciliation that happens all over the world, and couple of ways of looking at it is that understanding, accepting, and managing our own racialized thoughts. Actually, I should say that I'm a non-Aboriginal person, European ancestry, Irish and Belgian. And so that's part of that whole racism or racialized thoughts is an aspect, and then also deconstructing the institutional advantages of whiteness. And there's also an intercultural dialogue literature. So I'm interested in doing this through dialogue and finding out what we can discover by talking to each other, talking for non-Aboriginal people to talk to each other and to figure out what are some of the stories we can tell, the ways that we can understand why we might want to indigenize the academy. And one of the things to remember is that dialogical processes are always going on, and so they just need to be reinforced. And also, some of the ways that some of the rules or guidelines for dialogue can be, for example, that blame is not useful, but accountability is. This is a picture of a bentwood box that's traveling all over Canada with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So there is this official Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but I would be of the opinion that it's mostly Aboriginal people who are involved in this process and very few non-Aboriginal people. So it's still kind of a dialogue, a silo. The methods I'm looking at is holding dialogue groups, which might be talking circles or focus groups in 2 public post-secondary institutions in the Lower Mainland where I live, and then having over a period of months, say 4 months, something like 6 dialogues so that I can try and see if there's any change in the sophistication that we come up with in terms of our narratives. And we're just with a small group of people, let's say 10 people who stick with it for the 4 months. And then also I'm looking at an internet forum, so that possibly taking those 20 participants from those 2 institutions and see if we can expand it out a bit just to see what uptake we have. And also the online forum might give people more freedom to express other opinions. And I'm looking at it more from a discourse analysis or narrative analysis. So what themes emerge, what patterns emerge, what knowledge is required, and hopefully seeing that there's a change over time in that, let's say, even though it's a short period. And I'm kind of comparing it to other things that are happening around the province. So, for example, this is an event that happened at SFU in January. It was Reconciling Injustices. It was kind of linked to Reconciliation Canada and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This one talked about other pluralistic communities, Jewish immigrants coming to Canada after the Second World War, those kinds of things. And then another thing is, for example, in the health field in BC, there is a intercultural competency tool that's out there. So the product of my research, although I'm really focusing on what are those narratives, I might at some point be able to contribute to actually creating a tool to help with the indigenization process within the post-secondary sector. There's some evidence that these types of competency training could actually cause harm in addition to causing some benefits. So it's that's something that I want to look at as well. So thank you. Oh, there's that. Yeah, hi.
For the last maybe 6 or 8 years or maybe longer, Camosun College has been undertaking a very comprehensive program to indigenize their campuses. So I wondered if you were looking at those models or, some of see what, whether there's lessons to be learned from that.
Yeah, well, I definitely have a bias. I wouldn't call those kinds of models comprehensive. I think they're really happening in a silo. I think if you surveyed 100 random employees of Camosun College, most of them wouldn't be very aware of maybe even the program or particularly some of the content of that program. I think in general, most Canadians don't understand what the treaty process is and what our responsibilities as non-Aboriginal people are, as our governments have co-signed treaties, and we don't necessarily think about those things. So, so I could go back and analyze whether or not those are effective, but I'm starting from the assumption that they're not effective. Yes?
Okay, so I think one of the variables that would be really important is, there's a presumption post-secondary is if there's a new initiative or something we should be doing, we should be getting funding for it. So there should be some incentives from governments, etc. I had dinner with the minister and he assured me, in spite of Railroad's unique position, there's no more money. There's no money. In fact, most of our sister institutions are scaling back or cutting back. So in that kind of a context, is that a significant variable that's going to influence how much attention to or how much interest is or how much participation? In other words, how is it, it's a more complicated context when there's nothing new happening or no new funding to do the right thing, and in fact the cultures in many of these places is declining because things are getting worse. So how do you accommodate for that in terms of your research? You're going to get not a lot of support perhaps, or how do you turn that around? Have you considered that?
Yeah, and I had that same discussion with the minister, no money. So there is money. There has been money. There's been maybe $500,000 over the last 10 years. There's been 11 of the 25 institutions have been given grants called Aboriginal Service Plans. And I'm a partner in an Aboriginal Service Plan with Vancouver Community, in my work with Vancouver Community College and Capilano University. And there's a Aboriginal post-secondary framework document that's agreed between the Ministry of Advanced Education and their training partners, their Aboriginal training partners, which includes the leadership of the Aboriginal communities. And they're saying they want systemic change. So the policy of the government is for systemic change towards indigenization. There's other pots of money, funding money that's coming out. The federal government has just switched to this kind of same thing. So there's a lot of money out there. But my experience in working with Capilano University and Vancouver Community College is there's no systemic change. They get $100,000, in the partnership I'm with, they get $100,000, each institution gets $100,000 a year for systemic change, and it's very frustrating because, for example, coming from an Aboriginal post-secondary institution, we have 300 students, and all of them are Aboriginal, and everything we do is indigenized or indigenization. And we go with them, and with their $500,000 a year, they might do this little bit, and then but instead of saying this is what we do for the $500,000, they say every time we touch an Aboriginal student's life, that's indigenization. Whereas if I said that, it would like we have $5 million worth of funding, so that it's hard to separate out the $5 million worth of funding and then this little extra we get for indigenization, which is $100,000. So I only report on that. But with them, they see everything that they do in the area of working with Aboriginal students is indigenization. So there's very complex things, as you're right. So there is money. First, there is money there, and secondly, I'll probably have to look at maybe picking carefully which institutions I work with, although they all have indigenization committees. I was on the Aboriginal Community Committee of Simon Fraser University. I work with the people who are doing indigenization at every college and university, so I can maybe look at that component and pick carefully. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. The next presenter is Stacey Shore, and the title of her presentation is Success in the Oil and Gas Sector, What Drives Sustainability?
All right. So today I'm going to talk to you about my research. My talk is going to be divided into 3 parts. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why I'm interested in business and sustainability, a little bit about what I want to look at, and then some initial thoughts on my methodology. But on a side note, I've recently become interested in the concept of a 3-minute thesis. So the premise is that anything you need to know about somebody's research can be said in 3 minutes and 1 slide. Although I know I'm not going to meet the 3-minute criteria, I have only created 1 slide. So you can see that in front of you. So let's begin. So I currently work for a relatively large oil and gas company within their sustainability program, but that's not where my journey began. I first became interested in sustainability, particularly from the societal energy perspective, when I was studying the eating habitats of grizzly bears. I know a lot of you are probably wondering how the two are connected. The research that I was involved with was looking at how land use in the area of the Central Rockies was impacting the eating habitat. So looking at things like tourism, recreation, and energy development. It was during this time that I realized that I was interested in things that were much broader. And so I thought perhaps the pressures on the system, in this case the grizzly bear habitat, was actually due to policy or lack of policy. So my master's work looked at the impact of environmental policy on behavior. Once again, when I was doing this work, I realized that my interests were much broader. So, as you can see, the graph in the middle, it's depicting energy consumption broken out by primary energy source. So from 2005 to 2040, there's 2 things I want to draw your attention to. Firstly, you can see energy consumption increases. So from 2010 to 2040, it's predicted that energy consumption is going to increase by a rate of about 40%. Secondly, going forward, although you can see that the energy mix changes somewhat, oil and gas is still an important part of that mix, and that's depicted by the blue and the red. So liquids in this case represents oil, and plus things like methane, butane. So this leads me to my research. So I'm beginning to see a bit of a dichotomy. As a Canadian, we enjoy a very high standard of living, and this is in part driven by the fact that we have access to large sources of energy that are relatively cheap. Yet on the second hand, we see an increasing reaction to negative reaction to energy development. So if you believe that energy production or energy is a requirement for standard of living, and that the energy consumption is only going to increase over time because everybody's goal is to increase the standard of living, and that oil and gas is an important part of that energy mix, then an important societal question to answer is what's driving oil and gas companies to implement sustainability programs? And that's really where my research begins. So I'm defining sustainability from the perspective of the three principles: incorporating environmental integrity through environmental management, social equity through social responsibility, and economic prosperity through value creation. So the working definition that I'm using for sustainability is creating long-term value by integrating financial, environmental, and social ethical considerations into your business strategy. So as a practitioner in the oil and gas area, as well as my initial research, there shows that there's a large variance between the rate at which oil and gas companies are adapting sustainability. And so what I want to look at is what's driving these conditions and the conditions in which programs are being implemented. I'm using 4 theoretical frameworks to shape my research. Firstly, institutional theory, which says that external or societal norms are influencing organizational structure and processes. Stakeholder theory, which suggests that long-term sustainability of a business is directly influenced by the ability to account for its stakeholders, even if this means compromising some profits. Resource theory, which describes how resource shortages force organizations to pursue new innovations. And finally, resource-based view, which argues that firms possess resources that allows them to achieve competitive advantage and long-term superior performance. What I'm hoping to do in my research is to conduct a case study of oil and gas companies that are operating in North America that have successfully implemented sustainability programs. I want to take this information and develop a decision-making framework that I'm going to apply, a decision-making framework to help practitioners in the area use this knowledge to build sustainability programs. And the third piece is I actually want to test this framework on an organization that is in the process of developing a sustainability framework. So though my research is concentrated in oil and gas, and particularly in the North American context, I do think there's implication for broader areas, perhaps broader sectors as well as other jurisdictions. So with that, my time is up. And first, thank you for your attention, and be more happy to answer any questions. And I automatically am going to look to you, Alan.
Well, it's interesting. And as a successful graduate of the University of Calgary, I applaud your effort to do this. The issue is polarization. When you get into a topic in which there are really strong views, and as you work in it, you discover even more. So under those circumstances, as people become polarized, their interest or ability to collaborate or be reasonable diminishes. And how is what you're trying to do? How do you get to either reducing or accounting for that increasing move to polar positions and labeling of people who would say if you're not, if you're focusing on sustainability, you're really not doing the best for shareholder value, a whole series of things that would go there. What?
Right. So when I initially started this project, I thought, well, if I can prove the link between financial performance and sustainability, that would address that argument. And as I looked into it, there is some indication that financial performance does actually, sustainability does improve financial performance, but it's, especially when a resource company that's market-based, it's too hard to pull out just those factors related to sustainability. So I thought I'd take a different approach and actually look at companies that have successfully implemented the program under the premise that addressing risk, which in a resource company is things like environment, is things like stakeholders, that so assuming that you're addressing those risks, that you're going to have a competitive advantage over somebody who's not. And so then by looking internally at companies that have been seen as sustainable or have sustainable practices, and then to address your, I think kind of a comment as well as, that's sustainable, it means so much different to anybody. So to land on the companies that I think are sustainable, I'm going to be looking at external resources. So things like there's a lot of external rating agencies, either environmental rating agencies, investor rating agencies, that actually are ranking companies on their sustainability performance. So I'm going to look at those to determine the subsets of companies that have been deemed by other people as having sustainable practices, and then do case studies on those companies. Sure, there's questions.
The other energy sources, is that like solar? Or
Yeah, so that would be solar, hydro, biofuels.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, wind. Yeah.
Wind, for instance.
And I mean, you can argue whether or not you believe this mix. I mean, you can.
Well,
this is
I am wondering about that 2030.
Yeah, I mean, this is the International Energy Agency, and this is their base case. So it assumes the current level of policy, and so you could argue whether or not there's policy changes that are going to influence that mix. But I've looked at several different sources, and it really doesn't matter. Because what I'm looking at is this part here, and it's consistent that regardless of different policy options that you can put in that will increase renewables, for the foreseeable future, oil and gas is still going to be a big part of that mix.
Lisa, can you talk a little bit about these ideal companies that are sort of leading the way in terms of sustainability, and whether they live inside or outside North America?
Well, I want to look at just companies that are operating in North America. And some of those leading companies, there's a range. They're mostly either based from Europe, like Statoil would be an example, or Suncor would be another example, which is a Canadian base. And so some of the performance measures that are looked at for sustainability is really their ability to address certain risks around environment, around reputational risk management, operational risks associated with environmental, social, and governance. And the reason that I chose North America, or operating in North America, is because when you go outside into less developed countries, you find that you don't have the social framework, the regulation in place that actually helps you to measure that. So you have companies that are operating in those areas, but if there's no social system in place, they play a different role, and I didn't want to look into that. And then secondly, North American oil and gas is a big contributor to oil and gas in the world, so it's important to look at that from a jurisdiction.
You're looking at extraction and transmission companies, right?
I'm looking mostly at upstream oil and gas, so production. So the other thing that I wanted to look at that perspective is because you don't have the end user per se. So it's not like you can boycott going to the gas stations if you don't like. It's the people that are producing it and putting it into the system. So I'm trying to normalize the types of conditions that the companies would face, because like I think I mentioned that you can have two similar companies with very similar conditions as far as regulation that they're operating, the opposition to stakeholders, and yet the way they develop their programs is quite differently. Brian?
Thanks, Stacey. I really like the way you developed this in the last year. It's really nice, actually, for all of them to see the progress that's been made. Mine is mostly a comment, not really a question. I feel really uncomfortable with this use of sustainability. As you say, there really are a broad range of uses, but I think the Brundtland definition is a pretty good one, and it really focuses on the environment and people's use of natural resources and keeping options open in the future. This definition is really referring to the business and the sustainability of the business. And I think when you use that term in a context of environment, there is room for confusion, and I wonder if there isn't a better term to really say what you mean that is less confusing or even disingenuous.
It's actually corporate sustainability, but it wouldn't fit on my one slide. So,
these companies have every incentive in the world to make that last bar at 2040 as high as possible.
Yeah, but like I said, the energy, that's just to set the context. It has really nothing to do with my research. I shouldn't say it has nothing to do. It values the value of the research and the social implications, but the energy mix doesn't factor into my research.
No, but in our world where climate change is a major threat, and a major cause of climate change is exactly this that you show here on the most prominent figure on your single slide.
Right.
And congratulations for that. But you know, real sustainability would be some mechanism to reduce that demand.
I think it depends, like you said, on your definition of sustainability. And one of the things that I found in the literature is that regardless, there is no standard definition of sustainability. The Brundtland one is often referred to, but from a practicality point of view, it's not one that's used in the literature. So.
Can I just piggyback on Brian? Because I think the issue here is to what extent do corporate sustainability practices and policies contribute to overall sustainability of the planet, of the nation, et cetera, addressing issues like climate change? And I think it's not your topic, Stacey. I know it's not your topic. But in the back of your mind, I'd like you to be thinking about that. How's
Well, I mean,
that?
I think about that because
Might be the
that's the area
majority.
that I work in. But,
Okay.
yeah, but that's not, I mean,
Okay, sorry.
even just dealing with sustainability itself is a large topic to get your head around. And so this is within the context of something that I can actually research. I'm hoping.
I like that you've added ethical consideration, and the challenge going with Brian is when can we get to a point in which all three of those are significant criteria, as opposed to just the first one,
Yeah.
which is the motivation. And if we can establish through awards and things you talked about, ethical considerations, you know, one of the reasons that opportunities for women improved in organization wasn't necessarily due to regulation. It was because men started to realize that their own daughters were affected by the discrimination they faced, and so they took it upon themselves. So is there a way in which you start tying into, you know, this is just ethical practice or social responsibility, and that's a value in itself? I don't know whether it's possible, but I'd like to see those three things in balance.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stacey. We're finishing a bit early today because next week we have 5 presenters, and so we want to make sure everyone gets the same amount of time. I want to thank the students who presented today. It's always so interesting to hear what you guys are up to, and I hope you'll join us next week, same time, same place. Thank you.